Well, thank you very much for asking me to speak. It's a real pleasure. I do come to Cambridge, or I did do before the whole lockdown thing. I'm on the Cambridge County Council Design Review Panel. So I do occasionally come to Cambridge and look at schemes, which is really interesting. I like it very much. So I do know the city to some extent. So yeah, gear change in LTN 120. I'll start with gear change. So as Roxanne said, we were actually commissioned to work on to produce the new local transport note now, but oh gosh, about 2 years ago. And we'd finished it, and it was originally going to be called LTN 119, because the way it works is that it's just the 19 or the 20 indicates when it came out, and the 123 is which one of these LTNs was published in that year. And so it was the only one that DFT were working on, so it was going to be one of 19, and then it became eventually one of 20, and it took a long time to come out. When it did appear, we were really surprised to see it came with this other document, gear change, that as consultants we'd not been involved with. And as my colleague who worked on this with me, Adrian Lord, said, this was the first time in his experience that a design guide and a piece of kind of initiative had got stronger after it left the consultants and gone to the Department of Transport. Very often in the past, we've both worked on documents and there's been a kind of little bit of kind of watering down, oh, that's a little bit too radical. Here it actually went the other way. So that was really interesting. And quite a lot of that is in gear change. So gear change is the kind of snappy name for it. Despite the name, it is about walking as well. So a bold vision for cycling and walking, but it is the cycling and walking plan for England. There is going to be an update to the cycle and walking investment strategy, which the government has to produce every so often by statute. But this is a kind of interim piece of policy that's come out partly in response to the pandemic, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. So it talks about a step change in cycling and walking, huge challenge. The ambition is clear, and I think because of the pandemic, it talks about now this unique opportunity to transform the role that cycling and walking can play in the transport system and get England moving differently. So it's announced funding, so the 2 billion of new investment. That's obviously really welcome. But also the surprising thing was the announcement of this new body and inspectorate, Active Travel England, led by a new National Cycling and Walking Commissioner. Now, we're all kind of waiting to hear what that's going to mean, and what I've been told is that that may take a little time to get set up because they have to go through a process of kind of establishing a quango, but there is an intention there. And Active Travel England is going to be a much stronger body than the old Cycling England that was abolished back in 2011, I think it was, 2010, something like that. And one of its functions is going to be to actually enforce, and that's the word that they use, enforce the new LTN 120, to say that it will be used on all new schemes the government will fund. So that's really quite a strong message. So it says that clearly. It talks about the gear change introduces the document. So of LTN 120, as an interesting kind of game to be played is LTN 120 guidance or standards. The document itself says it's guidance, but gear change calls it standards. So it's kind of interesting. The way I kind of square it is that it is guidance, but for Active Travel England, it is a standard that local authorities are expected to work to. So it's almost, they're expected to take this guidance and themselves turn it into a standard that they use, and it will be a standard that Active Travel England looks to police, as it were. So we will now require that authorities work to it if schemes are to receive funding, and it uses the word enforced. It actually says utilize it. Elsewhere, it talks about embedding the guidance. So local highway authorities are expected to embed LTN 120 into their local standards. So quite strong words, really. Gear change includes statements about the kind of infrastructure it expects to see. So physically segregated bike tracks on main roads, the most important thing we can do to promote cycle use. So that's a really strong statement. It talks as well, though, it's not just about main roads. There's a strong thread in gear change and in the LTN about what we've now come to call low traffic neighborhoods, or we used to call filtered permeability. So you kind of filter out the car traffic. a great technique, not applicable everywhere. So if you have kind of post-war cul-de-sac based development, this doesn't work. But where much of our built fabric in our kind of inner suburbs and inner cities, we can take this approach of filtering out traffic. And interestingly, Gear Change talks about a community right to close side streets and create low traffic neighborhoods. Quite how that works is going to be interesting to see, because there's nothing to prevent residents conducting petitions now, but it talks about creating that as a right to petition highway authorities. So really empowering local people. This is Waltham Forest Mini Holland, one of Boris Johnson's, and Andrew Gilligan, who is Boris Johnson's transport advisor, we understand was one of the main kind of drivers behind Gear Change. They're now talking about expanding that program of Mini Hollands outside London up to 12 willing non-London local authority areas, to really get that kind of high dose, some people have called it, of investment in walking and cycling, to really demonstrate how the change can be made in towns and cities. Here's a first of several photographs of Cambridge, and I think I know some of it may feel this infrastructure is still not perfect, but let me tell you, we do a lot of work on new developments, and the quality of this cycle infrastructure here at Northstowe is a lot better than you would get on most new developments. And Gear Change says, it says about new developments need to be easily and safely accessible by foot and bike, and one of Active Travel England's functions will be a statutory consultee within the planning system for larger developments. So again, how's that going to work? But it all points to the fact that Active Travel England is going to be have a bigger role and be a bigger body than Cycling England ever was, and we wait that with interest. So that's a kind of bit of framing, really. So into the meat of LTN 120. I'll try not to make it kind of super techie, but I thought I'll at least cover some of the key points. So what is it? It replaces two previous local transport notes, two of 08 and one of 12. Two of 08 had the same title, Cycle Infrastructure Design, and one of 12 was about shared use. And we originally, it wasn't going to replace 112, but you'll see the reasons why. I'll come on to it. We just said 112 was incompatible with the new terminology and approach that was used in 120. So we recommended, and we were pleased that government accepted the idea that they would also withdraw 112. It applies in England and Northern Ireland. Wales and Scotland have their own documents. But he talks about in the forward, quality of the infrastructure must sharply improve. Again, it reiterates the condition of any future government funding for new cycle infrastructure. It's designed in a way that's consistent. But this is really interesting. To receive government funding for local highways investment where the main element is not cycling or walking, there will be a presumption that schemes must deliver or improve cycle infrastructure to the standards in this local transport note. So again, even though LTN 120 says that it's guidance and not standards, in the forward it calls itself a standard. So it's clear how government intends this to be received, and it actually does talk about as well, even where authorities are spending money that is not government money, and of course they could using this test not apply LTN 120. Active Travelling will act as this inspectorate and see whether generally highway authorities are following this guidance in everything that they do. So it really is being held up to be quite a powerful document. I won't go through this in all detail. We'll just give you a flavour. Obviously, you can have a look at the contents list yourself, but it's a lot bigger than the old document. It's not as big as some standards. So London Cycle Design Standards is a much bigger and more detailed document. But for Department for Transport, it's pretty detailed, really. And compared to other local transport notes, it has quite a lot more detail in it. So it talks about the planning process for cycling, talks about principles and processes. Chapter 5 is the basics of geometric requirements, almost regardless of the type of provision. And then I'd say chapter 6, 7, 8 are the real meat of it. And it talks about these three types of provision: space for cycling within busy highways, quiet mixed traffic streets and lanes, or motor traffic free routes. And it's kind of agnostic, really, between those. It says all of those can be good and can make up your cycle network. Then we've got transitions, junctions, that's a big chapter. Then we're into the kind of details of cycle parking, commercial cycling, which is cargo bikes and bike hire, traffic signs, a whole section about new developments and new highways and so on, and then construction. And then the appendices, I'll touch on a couple of these, the audit tools, which are quite important. So that's a quick overview. What's really changed from last time? Well, I think for the first time, DfT has set out in some detail what it considers to be acceptable. DfT in the past has rather kind of almost like hidden behind the highway authorities and said, well, here's some guidance, but really highway authorities themselves know what's best. Here it's taking a kind of stronger line really, and about what's acceptable. As I said, there's no hierarchy of provision. The old LTN said the best way to provide for cycling is to reduce traffic, motor traffic, and volume and speeds, so that you could safely cycle on the carriageway in a mixed traffic. It set that up as to be the preferred choice, and of course that's really difficult politically to do and technically to do. So it's neutral now. All of those three can be acceptable and can make up your network as you go from one to the other. So the old LTN 208 kind of, it was a bit of a counsel of despair really. It said there will be seldom space to create cycle tracks. Oh, okay. You know, I'm picking up a document that's about cycle design, cycle infrastructure design. It tells me in most places you can't fit them in. So then it says, okay, so in most places, your first choice should always be to see how you can reduce the volume and speed of motor traffic to make it acceptable to cycle on the carriageway. And only if you can't do that, do you then do something else. And if you can't do that, you do something else. And if you can't do that, you do shared use. And that was called the hierarchy of provision. So you kind of rattle your way down the hierarchy, and most of the time we ended up with shared use, you know. And LTN 120 doesn't say that. It says really, you know, and I think you've got this in Cambridge because you're investing very heavily in greenways. Greenways, if they're well lit and they feel safe, obviously they're safe from traffic, but you might have the issues of social safety. But they can be great places to cycle. And so can, and you know, an awful lot in Cambridge has been quiet streets because you've filtered out the traffic. You've had great success in that. They can be great places to cycle. Protected space on main roads can be great places to cycle. So rather than having this kind of artificial choice and saying, well, you must try that first, and then in a very kind of directive way, it's just saying, look, if we want good, this is what good looks like of this type, and you build up your network of those components as you best see fit. So it's kind of, say, neutral about that approach really. Really, junction design hasn't been covered in this level of detail before, and I'd say a much stronger emphasis on inclusive design, and that means inclusive cycling. You can see there that some of you will know that's Kevin Hickman, who's a great guy and cycles all over, even though he's got a major disability. You know, it really makes that a very strong statement, both in the text and the imagery, that's now important. So yeah, what hasn't changed? Well, really the geometric requirements, they haven't really changed very much. I think we hopefully stated them a little more clearly now. So absolute minimum of 1.5 meters for cycling, because that's the space that you need to have some clearance and for a different types of cycle, but desirable 2 meters so that one cyclist can pass another because it's comfortable. People are really ride at their own speed, and gradients and so on. So that's all kind of there, but hopefully a bit more clearly stated. And shared use, it remains the last resort. As I said, you know, if it was in there, it remains the last resort. We don't want to exclude it because sometimes it absolutely, is the only thing that you can do. But it doesn't rule it out. But I think what we're trying to say is that from a cycling point of view, there's a big difference between, in design terms, maybe the same legally, but a footpath or a footway that you're allowed to cycle on compared to something that's designed as a cycle track that you can walk on. Yeah, because you know one is smooth and direct and has priority over side roads, and that will be a cycle track. And but in that location, because the space constraints, or there are very few numbers of pedestrians who can legally walk on a cycle track anyway, that's fine. But it should be designed to be cyclable rather than, you know, poor quality, just kind of, well, get on the footway now, and give up at every side road. This is a really, really important table. It's table 4.1 in the document. And we thought about this quite a lot. So this is a chart that tells you, so we've left cycling along greenways we're now talking about streets, highways, and when do you segregate, and you know, and what is the speed and volume of traffic, motor traffic, when you would need to segregate? And in the past, there've been graphs that show you how to do this, and it almost implies that, okay, at this point below the graph, then you would do mixed use. You would be on low volume streets and you don't need segregation, and you would do mixed use. And above this line, you would protect, and somewhere in the middle, you do a cycle lane. We decided not to quite do that. We put a table in because even though at on 20 miles an hour with less than 2,000 vehicles a day, we say in this note, that's reasonable for most people to cycle in mixed traffic. But there's nothing to prevent you do a fully curbed cycle track in that situation. If you've got the space, and this particular street through a residential area is taking you to a primary school, and you want to do a fully curbed cycle track there, there's nothing to prevent you doing that. And if you do that, then you're in the top left-hand corner of the diagram. And of course, that is suitable for most people. So rather than kind of having again this almost like directive of saying, well, in this situation you should do this, in this situation you should do that, what this says is, with these design choices, if you make that choice to put in light segregation at this volume of traffic, what will be the outcome in terms of inclusivity? Will it be suitable for most people? Will it exclude some people, or will it exclude most people? So I guess in the pictures on the right, the top diagram, again, you've got a few of these around in Cambridge, I know, a kind of middle cycle lane, and for a reasonably confident cyclist, that's probably not too bad. I'm sure many of us would do that. I would certainly not feel too uncomfortable doing that, but the people in the bottom photograph probably wouldn't. And so this is really about making provision that most people, if we want mass cycling, if we want most people to do it, we have to provide the kind of facility that most people would regard as acceptable. And so it is just kind of raised the bar a little bit, really. So not what's inclusive, not just what's safe. I won't go into too much detail there, but many of you may have seen this before. These are the 5 Dutch principles of what makes good cycle provision, and actually you can apply it to walking infrastructure as well. So and they're repeated. They were in LTN 208, but and I think they're worth repeating because, particularly the first one, coherent. We've often done cycle infrastructure that doesn't connect up, and it's very difficult to follow. So if you want people to cycle, it's got to be easy, takes you where you want to go, without undue deviation or delay, that isn't feel safe, that is comfortable and smooth, and ideally is attractive. And if we can achieve those, and again, all of those you can achieve regardless of whether it's obviously some are easier. If it's in a park, you can make it more attractive, but nevertheless, we try to strive to achieve those 5 things. And the audit tools that I'll come on to, they're structured around those five core design principles. That we didn't invent them; they were invented by the Dutch through the Crow manual. So we've borrowed heavily on Dutch practice. Again, with a sort of emphasis on inclusivity, it talks about different types of cycle and the need to accommodate different types of cycle, and puts forward the idea of a cycle design vehicle, which pretty much covers the largest dimensions, and people are now beginning to use tracking software to demonstrate how vehicles, different types of cycle vehicle, can get through different space requirements. And obviously that has a big implication then for things like staggered barriers, which and staggered crossings, which the document says don't do them. Basically, just they're not inclusive. They're not the right thing to do. I won't say too much about this day, but just to say that of those 3 types, so mixed traffic, low, slow motor traffic, again, back to Waltham Forest, has been very inspirational. But I mean, I could have put some photographs of Cambridge here, I know. And if we do that, that really, probably most of the network, if we get that right, will be this kind of type of facility, because with very small amounts of infrastructure of bollards and closures, we can achieve whole areas that become suitable for cycling. And then motor traffic free routes. This is the route along the Danube, which I happily did a few years ago, and it was a great week of cycling. And I think it's probably still the most popular cycle route in Europe. And so, it just shows how important those greenways can be. So, I think it's great that Cambridge is investing in those Cambridgeshire. But when it comes to cycling with highways, again, we use the term protected space, and we talk about 3 types. So fully curbed cycle tracks, where there's a buffer and it's raised with a curb. Step cycle tracks, where there isn't a buffer and more the kind of Danish style. And then light segregation, where there's these intermittent features that give you some protection. And those have different applications. When it comes to the fully curbed cycle track, which obviously the aim, again, we sort of say that it doesn't really matter to the user what level that is at. So we talk about a cycle track at carriageway level, at intermediate level, or at footway level. And we're very keen that we, particularly in the bottom one, that we don't call that segregated shared use. Again, I always felt that this term that was in the old document, segregated shared use, it was a bit of a kind of oxymoron, really. If it's shared, it's not segregated. I mean, yeah. So we've said that is no longer a term to be used. Segregated shared use almost implied that this was one thing, a footway, that you happened to put a white line down, but it was still one thing that had been segregated. We're saying that bottom picture is actually 2 things. It's a footway and it's a cycle track. And you should regard them as 2 things, even though they are at the same level as one another, and they should be paved differently, and they should look different, and they should feel different. It's a kind of terminology and a design approach, really, that that term is better. So, carriageway level, intermediate level, footway level. So you can see in the right hand image there, that's I think on Blackfriars Bridge. Yes, there's a slight upstand, there's a rumble strip, it's not white paint, but you're left in little doubt there where you should walk and where you should cycle, even though for construction reasons and engineering reasons they are at the same level. So we think that terminology is kind of helpful. Again, I won't go into great detail, but there is quite a lot more information in this document, not as much as there is in documents like London Cycle Design Standards. I think Manchester is also producing stuff, and Cambridgeshire will, and this won't stop. There will be lessons to be learned, and knowledge will continue to be gained. But this is what we've put forward at the moment. So to a reasonable level of detail, to enable engineers to kind of pick up the document and get a reasonably good idea of how they should approach the design of junctions. And things like saying, no staggered crossings. Again, the bicycle or the cycle is a vehicle. It has a turning radius. It's not you're not a wheeled pedestrian, and therefore this kind of provision is just really, really poor, and we shouldn't be doing it. We should be doing stuff like this. So, and engineers tend to like staggers for pedestrians. It's felt to be safe because you get a green man so far, and then you have to turn and wait for the green man on the next crossing. But cycles go much faster. So in the same time that the pedestrians are getting across to the first island, the cyclists can be all the way across. So let's think about designing for them separately. This happens to be on the north fringe of Bristol. So that kind of approach, really, direct crossings. I won't go into this in detail, but there's another chart that looks like the other one that tells you different types of crossing, how many lanes you're going to cross, what the volume of traffic to be crossed is, and gives you a clue. And again, grade separated is the one that gives you a green box for everything. It doesn't matter. It's all, I mean, it's included there for completeness, but it's not kind of at grade crossing. It's a bridge to take you over the major road. We've spent a fair bit of time thinking about side roads, and I hope, I mean, I don't know, this is perhaps a bit of a bold claim, but I think this problem of if you take cyclists off the carriageway, which is where a lot of people would like to not be on the carriageway, they'd like to be in some protected space alongside the carriageway. You've then got the problem of how do you cross the side roads, and we've been trying to solve this, I think, since the 1930s. When cycle tracks were beginning to go in large numbers and major roads were being built, and because they weren't doing very well at that stage, organisations like the Cyclist Touring Club then began to campaign against these cycle tracks because they weren't giving that priority at side roads, and they felt, if to have their rightful place and priority, they had to cycle on the carriageway. And for a long time, we had this kind of split between the different cycle lobby groups. And I think if we can solve how to get cycle tracks safely and with priority across side roads, then that is the absolute key to making off-road provision work, and for more experienced cyclists being happy to use them and not feeling they've got to battle it out with the trucks. So we've included this diagram that we hope kind of sets the picture about how you do it. We've talked about the setback, so where the cycles are in relation to the carriageway, and then whether we have marked priority. In other words, there is full legal priority over traffic that's turning in and out of the side road, and we can do that with a parallel crossing in the top line, or we can do it with give-way markings in the middle row, or we can use something we call design priority, where just through the design of the facility, it's absolutely clear to the user who's got priority. And of course, you can use design priority with the marked priority as well to really strengthen it. So in the past, there's been all kinds of terminology of bent out, bent in, and we just think we've tried to kind of, again, just simplify and get a logical approach to this. And I know that Brian Deegan, who advises Transport for Greater Manchester, he's trying to come up with a missing one in the top right hand corner here, which will be the simple zebra or the simple parallel crossing that we can put right at the junction mouth, and hopefully we'll have the full set of 9 before too much longer. So, you know, just a photograph to show how this has been done. This is in Enfield, another mini Holland schemes, full setback. So it's a car length from the main road with marked priority. Legally, the cyclist has priority over the motor traffic at that point, but the pedestrians don't. Or we can do it with one of the new style parallel crossings. So again, this is partial setback. It's less than a full car length back, so that white car is actually having some impact on the vehicles going up and down, but it uses a parallel crossing, so both pedestrians and cyclists have got full legal priority across the side road there. We've also again, there's a lot to say about signals, but I won't go into it now. But one of the steps forward, and we had to actually we had to make the case, let's just say that, for this, which is what Manchester calls cyclops, but we couldn't use that term, but we called it a circulating cycle stage. So basically, it's a traffic signal junction. The motor traffic is stopped on all arms, pedestrians go all the way across, and cyclists go all the way around. So in the length of the green man or the green cyclist, people on bikes have got long enough to do a right turn, and this is in Waltham Forest again, where they pioneered. There's the same junction looking the other way. And this is how Manchester are doing it, perhaps a bit more gaudy. And there's a very nerdy debate going on about whether you have the pedestrians on the inside or the cycles on the inside. Manchester are doing it with the cycles on the inside, no, cycles on the outside. Waltham Forest did with the cycles on the inside. But the principles are much the same, and we've included that, which we think is a really important. And I understand. I think Cambridge is thinking about one. Roundabouts. So we can do mixed, so compact. If the flows are low enough, we go more to kind of continental geometry, which might look something like this on a mini roundabout. This one on a quiet way in London, and where we have bigger roundabouts, we either as a priority junction using the parallel crossings, which are great. Now we can use those on our junction arms, or we can do it with traffic signals where we provide signalized crossings. And of course, I'm really pleased that this has happened in Cambridge, and I know that there's been issues raised about it, but I think it's a great step forward. And if we'd had the time, we would have certainly put this photograph or a photograph of this junction in the document, but it just wasn't. We just couldn't make the cut. So that's really important. I'll just finish on LTN with the level of service tools. So these are really, really important, and they're in the back of the document. How good is this? Have we achieved an adequate standard, and will we get the money? And so it says schemes where you score 70% using these tools. That's what's needed to get funding. And the way the junction one works, you look at every move at a junction and you score it red, green, or amber, or banned, or impossible. And then you give it a score and you work out a percentage. So that's kind of how that works. So any junction, any movement, if it gets these conditions, cycle movement in potential conflict with heavy motor traffic flow, scores 0. Low traffic speed and volume, mixed traffic environment, access only streets, scores 2. So we hope it's fairly simple. Again, see how people use it. The cycle level service tool, again, scores things red, green, amber with the different sort of criteria. It's the same as the one that's in the Welsh active travel guidance. So again, this is more of a route, and the other one is junctions. So that's all I want to say about the LTN. Obviously, can go into questions about that. But I just thought I'd finish with a few slides about where I think we are maybe with some of the emergency situation. I do think it's significant. I mean, the fact that we're doing this on Zoom. I know that traffic volumes have come back up a long way, but I do think some of these changes might be permanent. This was an online poll. I was involved in a webinar, and you can see 90% of people on that particular call, this was back in June, said they would work from home more, and so that has kind of journeys to work. And then this guy, he is the head of land and development for Homes England, and he was talking about a tweet that he did in October last year of how he'd gone to Liverpool, London, Birmingham, Cambridge and Manchester for business all in the same week, and he loved it. And then he now says it was a lifetime ago and so unnecessary. So I do think we're going to see a lot less commuting and a lot less business travel. And I think that we have the opportunity to really bring traffic volumes down. And of course, we've seen that in the pandemic, and we've seen that car traffic, I last did this at the end of September, so it may have crept up a bit more, but it's kind of flattened off, higher at the weekends, but weekday traffic is down. Cycling was still up, even though public transport use is down. And if you look at congestion, which is really interesting as well, London, sorry, that should be blue, and that should be orange. But London is congestion's back up to where it was before. But a lot of that is because people aren't using public transport. In these other cities, which is the orange blobs, congestion is still something like 30% down, because the morning peak and the evening peak are where the commuter trips are not happening. And I think there is still a huge opportunity, if we grasp it, for road-based reallocation. So government is not blind to that, and they've made the 250 million funding, and the statutory guidance came out again in the summer, swift and meaningful plans to reallocate road space, and do this while we have this opportunity and seize the opportunity. But there's been a backlash, and if you read the media, the impression that you get is that these low traffic neighborhoods are incredibly unpopular. I don't think that's true. I think that many more people think they are popular, but you always hear from the kind of naysayers. And I know that some campaigners are starting to keep a kind of schedule of all these low traffic neighborhoods, including old ones, because we've been doing these for years as environmental cells, but just not calling them low traffic neighborhoods. And there are hundreds, and people are beginning to collect them. And it's only a handful that have actually come out under protest, and most of them are staying in. Like this one, which is one that we worked on in Birmingham, which is in King's Heath, that went in only in the last couple of days with planters and all the rest of it. And if Birmingham can do it, Motor City, I think anywhere can. So that was my last slide. I hope that's been useful, and very happy to go back in and take questions. The latter. I think there is that danger that if you call things Dutch, and I know the London Cycle campaign had this big Go Dutch campaign a few years ago when they were making that shift across to calling for protected cycle infrastructure. I think it plays well in some places, but in other places it doesn't. I think it's people who are trying to find reasons not to do this are always keen to say, oh well, of course that's Holland, it's flat, and they've always loved the bicycle, and we can't do that here. We're England. So yeah, we felt it wasn't a helpful term. So yeah, I know that people talk about the Dutch roundabout in Cambridge, and it's got a great profile as a result of that. But I think we felt we didn't want to kind of label it that way, because we didn't want to kind of overemphasize. This is very, and actually in many places it's a lot of the stuff in the document isn't Dutch, because our road rules are different. You can't just take stuff that works in Holland and apply it, because the way our traffic signals work, the way our road markings work, they're just not the same. So we have to find our own way of doing it and getting these principles embedded in UK practice, I think. So in terms of new development, there is a chapter on new development, and he says very clearly that it should apply. Obviously, it's local authorities who give approval to new development, and the county council is a statutory consultee. So it's up to the county council to really get behind it and say to developers consultants, of which we are one. You know, I mean, we do work for developers, and we are now. And it's interesting. We are now being asked by our developer clients to say, who are saying, we've been asked to work to this. How do we do it? Which is great. I'm really pleased that that's happening. Obviously, we're when we're in that consultants bit, we're a bit at the bottom of the food chain. Really, we can't force our clients to do anything. So that has to come from the local authority. So yeah, I think that's in the gift of the county, really, to enforce it. And in terms of existing routes, I'd say that the LC, I haven't said a lot about the planning. So this is about design. There's a whole process called LC WIP, which is a terrible name. But it just stands for Local Cycling and Walking Infrastructure Plan. And the idea is, and again, it's not mandatory, but I think government certainly encourages local authorities to do it. I'm not sure if Cambridge has done one. You're well ahead anyway with your planning. But if you were to take an area and you take your city or your towns within the county, and you say, okay, where is the demand for cycling and for walking, and what does our existing network look like, and where are the gaps and where are the deficiencies? And then you begin to formulate a program that gets you towards a network. And it can't be done overnight, but that's where you would begin to, clearly, if you've got a completely missing link, you would design it to LTN 208. If part of your network is just simply not good enough, then you would look and say, well, how can we bring it up to getting close to these standards? Maybe with the Dutch is we forget that we kind of go there now and you think everything's fantastic, but go back 40 years and it wasn't fantastic. And they've been on this process of continuous improvement for decades. And we're and Cambridge has been like that too. You know, you've done some really good things in the past, and you continue to improve. So I think that's how it is. And it just generally, raising the bar, I think, with that.
I'll just say in response to that I do believe that the county council will be bringing out a consultation on our local cycling and walking infrastructure plan imminently. So if anyone's not aware of that.
Agree. We've just done some work in the town of Faversham in Kent, and we went through exactly the same on behalf of the Faversham Town Council. Actually, we went through that exact same kind of illogical argument with Kent County Council about a year or two back, and we were able to make the case successfully, I'm pleased to say, to relax that rule. I mean, I won't go into detail, but I think it's an oversimplification of what government guidance is saying. That's one thing. I mean, I think in a nutshell, it depends what your measure of success is. If you think that by putting up a 20 limit, the only measure of success is that everyone does less than 20, then yes, of course, if the speeds are currently 28, 29, without traffic calming, you won't achieve that. But if your aim is to make the road safer and to reduce speeds, then it will have an effect. So, I think it's a kind of false logic, really. It's a false success criteria. So with Faversham, what we were able to say to the county was, look, we understand that there are some roads in this town where you wouldn't normally do just sign-only limits. But what that does, that weakens the effect of the limits, because it makes it less understandable if, well, I'm on a 20 road or a 30 road, where am I? You have to have loads more signs. So we said, look, if you just will kind of accept there are a few roads where the speeds are a little bit higher than you would ideally like, but in return for that, but if you then make the whole town 20, it is so much more legible and logical, and you can get all the residents of the whole town to buy into it and say, we're a 20 town, then let's do that. And Kent changed their policy, I'm really pleased to say. So they in May last year, they changed their policy and said, yeah, we will do this as a trial. And again, with some kind of emergency COVID money, the 20 mile an hour scheme in Faversham has just gone in. So that's a town of 20,000 people. And to my knowledge, it's the first time an entire kind of market town has gone 20. So we'll see. We'll see what effect it has. But I think there could be maybe some lessons to be learned for other rural counties. Because Cambridgeshire has got a lot of small market towns like Kent. So we'll watch with interest on that. Yeah, I think there is I can think of a case there that we did. I mean, we have neighbourhood plans, which is a planning document. I'm sure a lot of communities have been doing neighbourhood plans. I think what you're kind of talking about, maybe, or maybe one way of thinking about it, is a neighbourhood transport plan. So a village transport plan, which you might call it, you might call it a village LC whip if you want to kind of use the official term. And this LC whip process, or this planning process, it doesn't have to be a kind of big bang, lots of data. It can be just serious. People obviously more difficult these days until we get rid of this. But sitting around with plans and just saying, well, okay, where are people trying to get to on foot and bike, and where are the problems, and can we begin to from local people begin to identify some opportunities. And obviously I don't know the village, but could some of that be, if you've got some connected streets where you could effectively put in some planters and create some low traffic streets that get you to cut out through traffic by car? Could it be routes through green spaces and so on? Could it be if you do have space in some places, that you use what's called light segregation, where instead of just a painted cycle lane, you actually use kind of intermittent obstacles, which could be quite engineering things like bollards and stuff like that, but it could be quite attractive things like planters and pieces of art and stuff that just protects part of the road network, or create some one-way systems but allow cycling in both directions. It's difficult to say, but I think that sometimes these things, actually the techniques are not that complicated, really. The complicated thing is the political will and the willingness to perhaps change a little bit and maybe lose one or two parking spaces if that's the key. So that it's almost it's a bit like the 20 miles an hour, really. If the people of Faversham want to 20 town, then they just have to drive at 20. It's up to them. It's kind of in those people's hands for the most part. So a lot of it can be done, and it doesn't always have to be big traffic signal junctions and big expensive stuff.
All right, so I've just gone ahead and compiled some examples from Cambridge and the region and Cambridgeshire where local transport note 1/20 could be usefully applied, or has been. 1 second, there we go. I've jumped straight to Milton Road, actually. I'm going to just jump straight in, and I'm picking on it a little bit here, but actually Milton Road had the new design from the Greater Cambridge Partnership does actually comply quite a bit with the new LTN, kind of ahead of its time, thanks to the work of residents and Camcycle campaigning on this. It has things even like Cyclops junctions that are going to be built, as Phil has noted. But I did want to pick up this one thing that snuck in between the early designs and somewhere and the detailed designs. At some point, a bus lane north of Lovell Road was extended south, and that caused the cycleway at that point to become squeezed down to 1.0 meter width, and also the pavement is very narrow under that design. So just to extend the bus lane by 50 meters. This was done. And if you're familiar with the area, that's just north of Lovell Road, where a new crossing will be created. And of course, while much of the scheme is very good, 1.0 meters is well below the absolute minimum. As Phil included this chart as well on the bottom, the absolute minimum at constraints is 1.5 meters. And the reason for that, as he mentioned, is that we need to be able to support all kinds of cycles, including tricycles of all sorts of types, recumbents, hand cycles, cargo cycles, and they need a little bit of wobble room as well. So the cycle design vehicle, which is kind of like the standard vehicle to design around, is 1.2 meters in width, and then you have to allow for some wobble. So 1.0 is definitely too narrow. And what really needs to be done there is to accept that you can't extend the bus lane if you don't have the land to do it. And I'll move on to another current topic, which is the Station Square and the, what was supposed to be the Chisholm Trail eventually. But as many people know, it's a big problem currently, and there's a big development just north of this spot that's going to committee tomorrow. In fact, it's been 2 years that we've been working on this particular issue, and about almost 2 years ago, we asked the members of the public to chime in with their descriptions of cycling through the Station Square. And I just included this one snippet from Amanda. She said she was inches from being hit by a car that was entering the mini roundabout of death. And I've really enjoyed that particular nomenclature. So we've got the top-down view here of the Station Square and the mini roundabout of death, which has, unfortunately, over 10,000 motor vehicle movements per day, a lot of them taxis and people picking up, dropping off, and also a lot of delivery lorries coming through here and doing very strange things, as I've seen. So if we look at local transport note 1/20 and the junction assessment tool, it says that any type of roundabout with high traffic throughput, which means more than 8,000 motor vehicles per day, is not suitable for novices. It's not suitable for less confident people. It may even be avoided by some experienced cyclists. It gets a score of 0, and that kind of infrastructure wouldn't be funded. In addition, there's a specific note about mini roundabouts, which is that at larger and busier ones, off carriageway protected space for cycling should be provided. And so Smarter Cambridge Transport and us, we've proposed an alternative proposal, which actually takes the Chisholm Trail off the carriageway and avoids the whole mini roundabout mess by going on a different route. I won't get into the details there, but that's currently going to be evaluated by the committee tomorrow. Phil did mention Northstowe earlier. He actually meant Eddington, so I quickly threw in this slide because I've taken some photos at Northstowe, and let me tell you, it's not. Well, some of it is, yes, because of unfortunate phasing of development, but also there is some severe defects in the design process there. And what you see here are what are supposed to be cycleways, but most of them have become either parking or, for some reason, are grass. If we look at the design that led to this point, this is from a planning application conditioned discharge that was done recently, maybe in the last few months. We noted that they never thought about how people are supposed to cycle on the cycleways. So you have, on the left side, you can see there's a cycleway on the left coming up from the bottom, and there's one on the right. They don't connect. And they even stuck in some chicanes because they wanted to make things even harder. So to actually navigate yourself through this, you'd have to, make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 90-degree turns. And so on the right, I said, well, this is what you do to fix it. But when you think about those 90-degree turns, I mean, what your image in your mind should be of my friend Phil here, also Phil, he's an amputee. He rides in a hand cycle, and he can't navigate such things. We need to make cycling infrastructure that he can navigate as well as everybody else. And here I have an example of him on the busway where even simple things that you might never think about, like, these beg buttons for crossing the road, in some cases, he just can't reach them because of the way where they've been positioned. And luckily I was there to press the button for him, but I don't know, I guess in other cases, he just waits for somebody to come along. So stuff like that also needs to be thought about as well, just to be completely inclusive. I want to take an example from East Cambridgeshire. The recent Lancaster Way A142 roundabout consultation. This would also apply to the A10 Way 142 roundabout. There's a proposed expansion of the existing roundabout entry lane from 1 to 2 lanes. It's a pretty busy roundabout. I don't have the exact traffic figures, but it's definitely got to be in the 8,000 or so range. And this it already has an uncontrolled crossing, which is actually rather challenging to use currently. It's not suitable for all people and will exclude some potential users. And unfortunately, the current proposal is to make it even more dangerous to cross here by making it 2 lanes to cross and probably more traffic. And so that would exclude most users instead of just some. And LTN 1/20 suggests that the correct answer here is to actually put in a traffic signal crossing, or of course a grade separation would be nice, but it's not necessary. A traffic signal crossing would be suitable for most people in this position. So here's another photo out of the local transport node showing just how scary it can be to be on some of these uncontrolled crossings. And it mentions specifically for roundabouts. These types of crossings should only be used at roundabouts with lower traffic flows and speeds, and where there's no more than 2 traffic lanes to be crossed. Actually, I would say it should actually be no more than 1, especially on an exit, but that's something I'll take up with Phil. Another example that's also a live issue is the A1307 at Haverhill Road and the Gog Farm Shop, where we've had a very, very, let's say, vigorous discussion amongst all the stakeholders about what to do at this particular crossing. The A1307 is currently national speed limit, I believe, at this point, and they are proposing to reduce it to 50 miles per hour and undual the carriageway so that it's 50 miles per hour. But they were supposed to do a grade separated crossing, and then they reduced it down to an uncontrolled crossing with a refuge. But even though you only have to cross 1 lane at a time, because this has so many vehicles on it, 15,000 per day, if you look at the chart here again, that is considered to be provision that would exclude most potential users, whereas a traffic signal, which has been rejected up until now as an alternative to grade separation, would actually be considered suitable for most people. So I just wanted to run through a few quick examples. We could go through, honestly, hundreds, but I don't want to sit here all night. So any other questions would be welcome, and thank you for coming.
In terms of the development control process, I think it's certainly my experience, and I don't wish to be kind of unkind really, but there are differences of attitude sometimes between officers who work within a highway development control function and officers who maybe work in more general highway planning and perhaps with a foot in the kind of active travel camp. And I think perhaps it's because highway DC officers are often, they hear what the public says about new development, and what the public says about new development is always there's too much traffic. And so they feel kind of under pressure to kind of accommodate that traffic, to make sure that the developers provide enough highway infrastructure that any traffic impact is mitigated. And the mindset is often about providing more capacity so that there is no congestion, because that's what the public kind of expects. And I think maybe historically they haven't thought as much about the way you could deal with that traffic congestion concern by encouraging other forms of movement. And I think that's a kind of a bit of a mind shift that perhaps needs to go in parts of the profession. And because only when that changes, when development control officers feel that is going to be a thing that they should be asking for, they will then push the developers, who will push their consultants, and there will be a kind of leveling up and a learning process. But yeah, at the moment it is really unfortunate that you see sometimes, even within the same authority, some really good practice on existing highways where good at cycle infrastructure is going in, and then they're building rubbish on new highways. It's very frustrating. And I think we have to, that's maybe the profession needs to sort itself out really.
Yeah, I think also Cambridge and Cambridgeshire and the planning authorities in this area are a bit more enlightened, I think, in other parts of the country perhaps. But the practice of officers isn't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily meet those lofty principles that are expressed by the local plans. And then when it comes, down to brass tacks, things get lost, because the planning system is quite a complex thing. There's so much going on. There's so many concerns. And the fact that this new development just destroyed a cycleway with its access point can easily get lost. And I try to catch up with that by looking through planning applications, but there's only so much resource to do that. So it would be, I think, yeah, some of it is institutional, but hopefully the new guidance and gear change document from government will help to change that way of managing the highway network, so that it's seen as a priority to make sure that cycle routes are coherent and footways are coherent and things like that. I think you're absolutely right that we should be giving more time for people to cross roads, especially people who move slower are more vulnerable. And the argument that we need to maximize this highway capacity is something actually I was going to bring up in the previous answer. I forgot to. It's wrong, because the more capacity you provide, the more it fills up with cars, and that's exactly the mistake that's being made in the new developments as well. They think they can provide so there's no congestion generated by new development, but all that ends up doing is end up with stuff like this, where all the pavements and cycleways are covered with cars and everybody drives everywhere, and you just end up stuck back in that trap again. So it really, and I would say Cambridge is coming around to this and it has actually in the past. They realize that they have to reduce motor traffic capacity in order to reduce the number of cars coming into the city. And it's the only answer, especially with Cambridge's historic compact character that we all want to protect, because it's what makes life here so great. Actually, it's why we want to live here. And we hope that also the villages are also feeling the same way. They want to be compact places where people can walk around and get to know each other. And the only way you can do that and have that character is by reducing motor traffic. So it all comes down to that, really.
That's why I kind of showed those little thoughts. I do think we're at a tipping point. I do think if we don't throw away this opportunity, we are. The longer that we go on communicating and having meetings virtually, and I know that we all sometimes get a bit frustrated with that, and we would actually like to go back where we did meet people face to face a bit more. But I think there's an awful lot of travel, and particularly business travel, which is why I kind of put that tweet up, that is just completely unnecessary and so expensive and bad in terms of carbon emissions. And I do think if we have an opportunity now to just challenge some of these traffic growth forecasts or these traffic assumptions, and it's probably a much softer level of demand. That's one of the things that you find with the low traffic neighborhoods. I was talking to a colleague today. We've just done some work in Fleet in Hampshire, where they've actually put gates across the town's high street, which is an A road, and it carried 18,000 vehicles a day. And amazingly, they've closed it off to motor traffic. Now there is a parallel route which used to carry 3,000 vehicles a day, and that's now gone up to 6,000. So somewhere there's what's the math? Is it 12,000 vehicles have been lost? What's happening? And it just means that people aren't making those journeys by car anymore. They may be walking, they may be cycling, they may be going somewhere else, but kind of there's this assumption that traffic is somehow fixed and it's just going to keep coming at us, but it is people making choices, The idea of using trials is something that's today strongly supported in the LTN, and it could be about, as you say, point closures and low traffic neighbourhoods. It can also be about reallocation of road space. We included a couple of photographs in Leicester, which has done a lot. They have a pretty hostile ring road, inner ring road. It's been gradually tamed, but there was a 3-lane one-way road. And they just coned a lane off, and they felt it wasn't necessary to have 3 lanes. And for 6 months, they simply coned a lane off, monitored the traffic. There was no increase in delays, and that's now a 2-way cycle track. And it was, and you know, to model that is really difficult. What do you assume? And actually, it wasn't a problem. So I think trials are really powerful and enable people to see what it actually will be like. I mean, we put a little bit about that. I think the focus of the document really is more about the infrastructure, and this is really, you know, just a kind of making that point. But I think generally in transport policies, then there's certainly scope to do that. The government at the moment, I don't think they haven't yet strongly supported it, I think is fair to say. But the government is working on something at the moment called the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. So in March, again, I think it was all worked on pre-COVID, and it was rushed out just at the point where the whole lockdown thing began. And it's quite a good document, and it sets out in there the huge challenge that there is over carbon emissions, and the fact that transport is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the UK. So a lot will have to be done, and I've been on some webinars with DFT and sort of certainly pushed this argument. So I hope they're listening. I think there have been some grants available for cargo bikes at the margins, but there hasn't been a huge push so far. So I would hope that as part of the transport decarbonisation agenda, that it will get a greater push. And of course, it's also, you know, very good in terms of air quality and congestion relief as well. So yeah, that's it. Yeah, Roxy's put that. So yeah, I think more to be done, I think, in a nutshell. But yeah, hopefully that's the direction of travel.
And I'll say that we're working with Click local businesses in Cambridge to put together an article for our upcoming magazine, and my colleague Rosie, who's been talking to them, was just telling me today about how fantastic it has been for their businesses. So I think we also just have to keep championing the good case studies and get that word out there.
I hope so. I think the planning white paper is an opportunity. So, I mean, it's really unfortunate that there used to be some very good guidance on transport assessments that was, I think, probably written in about 2007-8. And it talked about you would predict the amount of car traffic, and if that was too much for the network, you would then reduce that. The method of reduction there was the travel plan, you know, about using softer measures. But I think you could update that and say, well, you would reduce that through infrastructure, through actually providing the ability for people to make to use different modes of travel, or work at home, or greater mixed use, or whatever. There have been some conversations. I think, you know, the planning white paper obviously turns the planning system on its head. It comes down to much more once the allocation has happened, effectively that is the planning consent in principle. So that means much more will have to be, if that happens, I know it's very controversial, but if that happens, much more will have to be done up front, much more will have to be done at the local plan stage, when the local highway authority or the transport authority can get involved, and perhaps to begin to take a more holistic approach along the lines that the CIHT document talked about. And I think maybe as part of that, or certainly as part of that, sorry, I was going to say that guidance on transport assessments, it was withdrawn in 2012, I think, and has never been replaced. You know, there is some stuff in the MPPG about transport assessments, but it's pretty weak. And it doesn't really, as you say, it's a kind of traffic mitigation plan, really. So I think the time is long overdue that we need to go back and revisit transport assessments. I mean, it's something that we do as a practice. That's kind of bread and butter to us, and it pains me to, you know, the way that we're required to do them, really. But we do them, and you know, I'd love to have the support and the framework to be required to do them in a different way. It would be great.